By dawn in 1924, somewhere up in Price County, Wisconsin, the sled dogs at the landing barked at nothing and refused to cross the yard. Slate's harness lay folded on the mail hook near the bunkhouse door, the leather still warm enough to steam in air cold enough to crack sap. The gray Husky who wore it every violet evening for the run to Mile 7 was gone. His paw prints showed clear in the snow for 50 yards up the logging road where the grade steepens and the pines crowd so close a man can't see sky. Then the print stopped. Not faded. Not covered. Erased. As if someone had taken a flat blade and scraped the crust smooth as a blank page. Men in Wisconsin still won't work Mile 7 alone after the sun drops behind the ridge. Price County ran on timber that winter. The tall pines came down under crosscut saws, and the camp sat scattered through the forest wherever the cruisers marked good wood. The snow lay deep from November through March, and the cold came down hard enough to freeze a man's breath to his beard. Logging crews worked the winter months when the ground froze solid, and the big sleds could haul loads that would snap an axle in summer mud. Slate belonged to the sled yard at a camp just south of the Flambeau headwater, a place with no name on any map, but known to every cutter and skidder within 10 miles. The camp sat in a clearing hemmed in by second-growth spruce and old white pine, with a bunkhouse, a cookhouse, a stable for the draft horses, and a small shed where the sleds were stored upside down to keep the runners from rusting. Slate was a working dog, 3 years old, steady and silent, the kind that ran mail and small supply between landings without fuss. His coat was the color of wet slate rock, his eyes pale amber, and his chest broad enough to pull a light sled on his own if the trail was packed. His driver was a Swede named Torvald Eck, a man in his 40s who had come over young and worked timber in Michigan before moving north to Wisconsin. Torvald never raised his voice and trusted the dog to make the evening run on his own when the load was light and the weather clear. He had a daughter, Ingrid, barely 8, who lived in the camp through the winter, while her mother stayed with family downstate. Ingrid used to wait on the bunkhouse step for the soft jingle of Slate's bells, and when the dog appeared out of the dusk, she would pull the mail pouch off his harness and carry it inside like it was something precious. Slate slept near the stove in winter and drank from a tin bowl Torvald kept filled even when water had to be melted from ice chipped off the horse trough. On the evening it happened, the sky went violet early, the way it does in deep winter when snow is coming but hasn't started to fall yet. The air tasted metallic, and the cold sat so heavy it seemed to press down on the tops of the pines. Torvald hitched Slate's harness and hung the mail pouch, a small canvas sack with 3 letters for the upper camp and a requisition slip for saw oil. The dog trotted out across the yard and up the road toward Mile 7 with his bells chiming soft and even, the sound fading into the trees like water disappearing into sand. The temperature sat well below 0, the kind of cold that makes breath freeze before it leaves your mouth, the kind that turns boot leather stiff as iron and splits green wood down the grain. 2 men hauling an empty sled back from the upper landing heard Slate's bells once, clear and close, coming up the grade ahead of them. The road there runs through a stretch where the pines lean in from both sides and the snow stays blue even at midday. Then they heard the bells again, this time behind them, though the dog had already passed going the other direction. Both men stopped. One of them, a Finn named Laurie, said later his chest went tight and he couldn't pull a full breath, as if the air had thickened into something he couldn't swallow. They stood there in the middle of the frozen road, listening. The bells stopped. They called out, their voices flat and dead in the cold air, and got no answer. The silence that came after felt wrong, too deep, as if the forest had pulled all sound into itself and wasn't giving it back. When they reached the spot where they had heard the first jingle, they found Slate's tracks running clean and strong up the center of the road, 4 paws, evenly spaced, and the light drag marks from the mail pouch swinging against his side. 50 yards further, the tracks ended. Not at a tree, not at a drop or a drift or a wind-blown gap, just ended, mid-stride, in snow that sat unbroken and smooth as if no living thing had ever touched it. The 2 men knelt and ran their gloved hands over the surface. The crust was hard, wind-packed, without a crack or a seam. Laurie said it looked like someone had taken a trowel and smoothed the world flat right where the dog should have kept walking. They walked the road in both directions with a kerosene lamp, bent low, checking every shadow. The lamp flame barely moved in the still air. They found a boot nail lying in the center of the road where no boot print stood, its iron head glinting dull orange in the lamplight. When Laurie knelt to pick it up, he pulled his hand back fast. The nail sat in a faint haze of heat, a shimmer like you see over summer ground or hot metal fresh from a forge, though the air around it was cold enough to kill a man in an hour if he sat still. He wrapped his glove around it and carried it back to camp in his palm, and even through the wool he could feel it warm, a living heat that didn't fade even when the wind picked up and cut through his coat like wire. Torvald took a crew of 6 men and went back up the road just after midnight with lanterns and steel hooks on long pine poles, the kind they used to pull logs out of timber tangles or drag the river in spring. They walked shoulder to shoulder in a line, sweeping the ground with the hooks, checking every drift and deadfall and hollow stump. The lanterns threw long shadows that slid across the snow and bent wrong against the trees. The other sled dogs, harnessed and ready to help with the search, lay flat in their traces and whined high in their throats. Not one would stand. Not one would cross the invisible line where Slate's prints had stopped. Torvald tried to pull his lead dog forward by the collar, a big brindled male that had never balked at anything, and the animal tucked its tail and urinated in the snow, shaking so hard his harness bells rattled. At midnight, one of the men shouted and pointed with a shaking hand. 2 sled tracks, fresh and deep, ran parallel beside the road for 30 yards, the grooves clean and straight as if a loaded sled had just passed. But there was no sled, no dog, no driver, no prints of any kind leading to the tracks or away from them, just the 2 runner marks appearing out of blank snow and ending just as sudden. When Torvald bent close with his lantern, he saw that the wood at the bottom of the grooves looked scorched, darkened like someone had held a flame to them, though nothing in that cold would burn without a fight, and there was no smell of smoke anywhere in the air. By dawn they had found Slate's neck strap. It hung from a low spruce twig just off the road near mile 7. The leather still fastened in a loop as if it had been slipped off whole, rather than cut or torn. Torvald reached for it and jerked his hand back as if he had touched a stoveplate. The strap was warm. Not cold warm, the way a thing warms slow in your grip. Warm the way a living thing is warm, the way it would be if the dog had just shrugged it off a moment before and walked away. It smelled sharp of pine tar, though Torvald had not treated the leather in weeks and kept no tar in camp. He wrapped the strap in a grain sack and carried it down in his coat, and later told the cook that the warmth lasted all the way back, fading only when he set it on the long table in the cookhouse under the oil lamps. The mail pouch never turned up. Neither did Slate. The crew walked every yard of road between the camp and the upper landing for 3 days, and found nothing else. No blood, no fur, no tooth marks or claw marks or any sign of struggle. Just the nail, still faintly warm in Torvald's pocket. Just the ghost sled tracks that no one could explain. Just the warm strap hanging in the pines like a man might hang a coat after a long shift, casual and wrong. Old hands in northern Wisconsin still tell the younger ones that you don't run dogs alone up near mile 7 once the light starts to fail, and they don't say it like a joke. The camp foreman moved the night haul crew to an earlier start that same week and never explained why. Torvald Eck left Price County by spring and took Ingrid south to a farm in Waupaca County where no pine grew tall and no sleds ran after dark. The sled yard stayed open another 2 winters, but the mail route was cut short at mile 5, and no driver ever took the run to mile 7 alone again. Not for wages. Not for any reason. The timeline didn't hold. Men in the camp tried to put the hours in order afterward, sitting around the cookhouse table with pencil marks on butcher paper, but the sequence kept breaking apart in their hands. Slate had left the yard at 5 in the evening, just as the last light pulled back behind the ridge. Torvald marked it in the camp ledger the way he always did. Dog out 5 p.m., mail run mile 7. 3 witnesses saw the Husky trot past the stable and up the logging road with the canvas pouch swinging from his harness, his bells chiming steady. One of them, a skidder named Arrow, said the dog moved calm and sure, the way he always did, and there was nothing wrong in the air yet. The cold had a bite to it, but the sky was clear enough to see stars starting to prick through the violet overhead. By 6 o'clock, 2 men on the upper landing heard bells coming up the grade from below. They were stacking cant hooks near the turnout at mile 7 and didn't think much of it. One of them, a Pole named Joseph, said later he heard the bells pass maybe 30 yards downslope in the pines, moving steady uphill, and he called out, "Evening, Slate," the way you do when a dog goes by in the dusk. He got no answer, but that wasn't strange. Dogs don't talk back. 20 minutes later, Laurie and his sled partner were hauling empty back down toward camp and heard the same bells behind them on the road. Both men stopped and turned. The sound was close, maybe 10 yards back, clear as anything. Then it stopped. Laurie said his skin went tight and his throat closed up and he couldn't say why. They waited. The bells didn't start again. They walked back up the road with the lantern, checking the snow, and that's when they found the tracks that ended in nothing and the boot nail sitting warm in the frozen rut. The problem was this. If Slate had passed Joseph going uphill at 6, and Laurie heard him going downhill at 6:20, the dog would have had to turn around in less than 20 minutes and come back faster than he went up. And the tracks Laurie found weren't heading down. They were heading up mid-stride in clean snow with no return marks anywhere. People in Price County still ask which bells were real and which were something else. The search began in earnest the next morning just after dawn. Torvald called in men from 2 neighboring camps, and by 7 o'clock there were 19 men standing in the yard with axes, pike poles, coils of rope, and 5 more dogs on short leads. The foreman, a Norwegian named Halvorsen, divided them into 3 teams. One team would walk the main road from camp to mile 7 in a sweep line. One team would check the side trails and skid paths that branched off into the timber. One team would stay near the spot where the tracks ended and work outward in a spiral, marking their progress with strips of red cloth tied to low branches. The snow was hard-packed from sled traffic and wind, and it didn't give up much. The men walked slow, bent low, checking every depression and shadow. They found deer tracks, marten tracks, the scuffed line where a porcupine had dragged its tail. They found nothing that looked like a dog after the place where Slate's prints stopped. It was as if he had stepped off the edge of the world, and the world had sealed shut behind him. By mid-morning, the men working the spiral found something that made them shout for Halvorsen. A second set of tracks, smaller and lighter than Slate's, appeared in a hollow 20 yards off the road. The prints ran in a tight circle 4 times around and then stopped in the center with no exit trail. Halvorsen knelt and put his hand into one of the prints. The snow inside was warm, not melting warm, body warm, as if something living had just lifted its paw and walked away through air. One of the younger men, a Finn barely 16, bent over and vomited into the snow. The older men didn't say anything, but they tied a double strip of red cloth to the nearest tree and moved the search line further out, away from the circle. At noon, Torvald brought the camp dogs up to help. All 5 were experienced trail dogs, steady and strong, the kind that didn't spook at shadows or strange scents. He led them on short ropes toward the place where Slate's tracks ended, thinking they might pick up something human noses couldn't. The dogs pulled willing until they reached the invisible line where the prints stopped. Then all at once every dog sat down hard and refused to move. Torvald pulled. He coaxed. He knelt in the snow and spoke to them in Swedish, soft and low. The lead dog, a brindled male named Odin, tucked his ears flat and began to shake, his lips pulling back from his teeth not in a snarl but in something closer to fear. When Torvald tried to drag him forward by the collar, Odin urinated in the snow and lay flat on his belly, whining high and thin. The other men saw it and backed up a step without meaning to. One of them made the sign of the cross. Another spat into the snow and muttered something in Polish that nobody asked him to repeat. By early afternoon, the search teams had covered every yard of road and trail within half a mile of mile 7. They had found the warm nail. They had found the warm strap hanging in the spruce. They had found the ghost sled tracks that appeared out of nowhere, and the tight circle of prints with no exit. They had found nothing else. No blood, no fur, no torn cloth or scattered mail. No sign that Slate had been dragged or chased or taken by any living animal. Then, just before 3 o'clock, one of the men checking the upper skid trail came back down to the road walking fast, his face pale under the brim of his cap. He had found another red cloth strip tied to a branch near the turnout at mile 7. The problem was that no one on the search teams had gone that far yet. Halvorsen walked up to check it himself. The cloth was the same type they were using, torn from a wool shirt, but it was tied in a knot none of the men recognized, tight and complicated. The kind a sailor might use or someone who worked rigging. Nobody in the crew had worked ships. Nobody could say who tied it. The cloth hadn't been there the day before because Joseph had stacked tools in that exact spot and would have seen it. Halverson cut it down with his knife and put it in his pocket, and told the men not to talk about it in camp. That night, after the search was called off for the day, the crew sat in the cookhouse drinking coffee that had gone bitter from sitting too long on the stove. Torvald sat at the end of the table with his head in his hands, not speaking. The older loggers, men who had worked Wisconsin timber for 20 years or more, began to talk in low voices about rules. "You don't go up that road alone anymore," one of them said. His name was Knut, a Swede in his 50s with hands like oak burls. "Not after dark," another man added. "Not even in a pair. 3 men minimum, and you carry a lantern even if the moon is full." Torvald looked up. He was a dog, a good dog. He ran that road 100 times. "He was," Knut said, "and now he's not. And the road took him in a way that don't make sense, so we don't give it another chance." The younger men looked at each other but didn't argue. In the logging camps of northern Wisconsin, when the old hand said a place was bad, you listened. The search continued for 2 more days. They walked grids. They probed drifts with pike poles. They climbed trees to scan the forest from above. They dragged grappling hooks through a shallow creek that ran near mile 7, even though the ice was 2 inches thick and nothing could have broken through. They found nothing. On the 3rd day, just after sunrise, a man named Einar went to check the spiral search area one last time before the crew moved further west. He found a second strip of red cloth tied to the same tree where they had found the warm circular tracks. This strip hadn't been there the day before. Einar knew because he had been the last man to leave that spot at dusk, and he had looked back twice to make sure he was walking the right direction out. He didn't cut the cloth down. He walked back to camp and told Halverson, and Halverson told him to leave it where it was. That afternoon, the foreman called off the search. There was no body to recover and no trail to follow. Whatever had happened to Slate had happened in a way that didn't leave normal signs, and the men were starting to look over their shoulders too much to work safe. The camp doctor, an old Swede who came through once a month to check injuries and dose out quinine, heard about the search when he arrived the following week. He sat in the cookhouse and listened to the men talk, and then he said something that nobody wanted to hear out loud, but everyone had been thinking. "There are places up in these woods that don't want company," he said. The old Ojibwe used to say so. They had names for certain places, and they didn't camp there, and they didn't hunt there, and they sure as hell didn't send their dogs there after dark. You people just cut your roads wherever the trees are tall, and maybe you cut through a place you shouldn't have. Nobody answered him, but after that, nobody in Price County took the mail run to mile 7 alone, and the night crews started coming back to camp earlier than the foreman's schedule required. By the end of the first week, the search had become something closer to ritual than rescue. The men walked the same ground over and over, not because they expected to find anything new, but because stopping felt like giving up, and giving up felt like betraying the dog and the man who had raised him. Torvald marked the grids on butcher paper tacked to the cookhouse wall, dividing the forest around mile 7 into numbered squares. Each square was walked by at least 2 men, and when they finished, they initialed the square in pencil. By the 9th day, every square had been walked 3 times. The paper was gray with erasures and corrections, and some of the squares had been crossed out entirely with the word checked written over them in Torvald's careful hand. The camp foreman brought in a crew from the civilian conservation camp 20 miles south, young men who didn't know Slate and didn't have the same fear the older loggers carried. They worked fast and methodical, dragging grappling hooks through the frozen creek, probing snowdrifts with long iron rods, climbing the tallest pines to scan the canopy for any sign of a body caught in the branches. They found nothing. One of them, a boy from Milwaukee, barely 18, said later that the forest around mile 7 felt wrong in a way he couldn't name, like the air was too thick and the shadows too long even at noon. On the 10th day, something happened that nobody could explain and nobody wanted to talk about afterward. Torvald kept a camp ledger in the small office shack near the stable, a thick book with a leather cover where he recorded the daily operations. Timber cut, sleds dispatched, supplies received, mail runs completed. Every entry was dated and initialed. The book sat on a shelf above the stove, and Torvald was the only man who touched it. On the morning of the 10th day, he opened the ledger to record the previous day's work and found a new entry on the page for the night's slate disappeared. The entry was written in pencil, in handwriting that looked like his own. It said, "Dog back, 11:47 p.m., harness intact." Torvald sat down hard on the stool and stared at the page. His hands were shaking. He called Halverson in and showed him the entry without saying a word. Halverson looked at it for a long time, then looked at Torvald. "Did you write that?" he asked. "No," Torvald said. His voice was barely a whisper. "When did you last open this book?" 2 days ago, to record the CCC crew arrival. That line wasn't there then. I would have seen it." Halverson ran his thumb over the pencil mark. The graphite was fresh, not smudged, as if it had been written recently. The handwriting was neat and controlled, the letters evenly spaced. It looked exactly like Torvald's writing. The same slant, the same pressure, the same way he formed the capital D in dog, with a slight curl at the top. "Could someone else have written it?" Halverson asked. "Nobody else touches this book," Torvald said, "and nobody else writes like I do." The two men sat in the office for a long time without speaking. Outside, the saws were running, and the skidders were dragging logs down to the loading platform, the normal sounds of a logging camp in full operation. Inside, the air felt cold and tight, and neither man wanted to touch the ledger again. Later that day, Torvald brought the book to the cookhouse and showed the entry to the older loggers. They gathered around the table and looked at it in silence. One of them, a Swede named Sten who had known Torvald for 15 years, shook his head slowly. "That's your hand," he said. "I've seen you write 100 times. That's you." "It's not me," Torvald said. "I didn't write it." "Then who did?" Nobody answered. The question hung in the air like smoke. Knut, the oldest man in camp, leaned forward and squinted at the entry. 11:47 at night, he said. "That's almost 6 hours after the dog went out. That's after we found the tracks that ended. That's after we found the nail in the strap." "It doesn't make sense," another man said. "None of it makes sense," Knut said. He looked at Torvald. "But somebody wanted you to know the dog came back. Or something that looked like the dog came back. And whatever it was, it didn't stay." The men sat with that for a while. Some of them looked at the floor. Some of them looked at the door as if they wanted to leave but couldn't make themselves stand up. One of the younger loggers made the sign of the cross and muttered something under his breath in Finnish. Torvald closed the ledger and took it back to the office. He didn't make any more entries after that. The book stayed on the shelf, untouched, until he left Price County in the spring. That same afternoon, another impossible thing happened. A skidder named Henrik was checking the high trail near mile 7, walking alone even though the foreman had told everyone to work in pairs. He found Slate's neck strap hanging from a different tree than the one where they had found it the first time. This tree was a birch, pale and thin, standing alone in a small clearing about 40 yards off the main road. The strap hung from a low branch at eye level, the leather loop still fastened, warm to the touch. Henrik didn't touch it. He backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the strap, and walked fast back to camp. By the time he brought Halverson and 2 other men back to the clearing, the strap was gone. The branch where it had hung was bare. There were no footprints in the snow around the tree except Henrik's own. The men searched the clearing and found nothing. Henrik swore he had seen it, swore he had been close enough to smell the pine tar, swore the leather had been warm enough to steam in the cold air. The other men didn't call him a liar, but they didn't say they believed him either. That night, the strap appeared again. Torvald found it hanging on the mail hook outside the bunkhouse door, in the same place where Slate's harness had always hung when the dog came back from a run. Torvald stood in the doorway with a lantern in his hand and stared at it. He didn't move for a long time. Then he reached out and touched it with one finger. The leather was warm. He called for Halverson. By the time the foreman arrived, 3 other men had gathered in the yard, standing back from the door, watching the strap hang in the lamplight. Nobody wanted to be the one to take it down. "It's the same one," Torvald said. "Same buckle, same wear marks. I know this strap." "Where's the one you brought back from the tree?" Halverson asked. "In my footlocker, inside the bunkhouse, wrapped in a grain sack." The men went inside and checked. The first strap was still there, cold now, folded in the bottom of Torvald's trunk under 2 wool blankets. They brought it out and laid it on the table next to the lantern. Then Halverson went back outside and took the second strap down from the hook. He brought it inside and laid it next to the first. They were identical. Same size, same buckle, same stitching, same dark stain on the inside where the dog's fur had rubbed the leather smooth over years of use. The only difference was that the second strap was still faintly warm, and the first was cold as the air outside. "How is this possible?" one of the men whispered. Nobody answered. Torvald picked up the warm strap and held it in both hands. His face was pale, and his jaw was tight. "He's trying to come home," he said. "Slate is trying to come home, and something won't let him." Newt, standing in the doorway, shook his head. "Or something is pretending," he said quietly. "Pretending it's the dog, leaving pieces of him where we'll find them, like bait." The room went silent. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked in the cold with a sound like a gunshot. After that, theories began to spread through the camp the way frost spreads across glass. Some of the men said Slate had been taken by a wolf or a lynx, dragged off the road so fast he didn't have time to fight, and the strange things they were finding were just coincidence, tricks of the cold and the fear playing with their minds. Others said the dog had fallen through thin ice on the creek, even though the ice was solid and there were no breaks anywhere. And the rest was just the woods being strange the way woods are strange in deep winter when men spend too much time alone. A few, mostly the youngest men who hadn't been in the north very long, said someone had stolen the dog for breeding or for spite, and the ledger entry and the duplicate strap were pranks meant to scare the camp. But the older men, the Swedes and Finns and Norwegians who had worked timber for decades and knew the forest in a way the young ones didn't, said something different in low voices when they thought no one was listening. They said the land around Mile 7 had always been strange. They said the Ojibwe who used to trap and hunt in that country never camped there, never stayed after dark, had old names for certain places that meant "don't go," or "turns you around," or "takes without giving back." They said the logging companies had cut roads wherever the trees were tall, and maybe they had cut through a place that should have been left alone. They didn't use the word spirit. They didn't use the word ghost, but they said the woods had ways of making a man disappear, or a dog. And sometimes what came back wasn't what had left. And sometimes nothing came back at all except pieces, warm pieces, laid out like a message nobody wanted to read. Torvald listened to all of it and said nothing. He kept both straps in his footlocker and didn't go near Mile 7 again. Ingrid stopped waiting on the bunkhouse step in the evenings. She stayed inside by the stove and didn't ask when Slate was coming home. By the end of the second week, the search was officially called off. The men went back to cutting timber, but they worked faster and quieter than before, and nobody took the mail run to Mile 7 anymore. The route was shortened to Mile 5, and anything that needed to go further was sent by sled with 3 men and a full team of dogs. People in Wisconsin still don't talk much about what happened that winter, but the ones who were there, or whose fathers were there, know the rules. 2 men minimum. Never 1. Never after the light fails. And if you hear bells on the wind near Mile 7, you don't follow the sound. The camp at Mile 7 stayed open through the rest of that winter, but the work slowed and the mood never lifted. Men finished their contracts and didn't come back the next season. New hires heard the story within their first week and learned the rules before they learned where the tools were kept. Torvald Eck left Price County in April of 1924, as soon as the spring thaw made the roads passable. He took Ingrid and what belongings would fit in a wagon and went south to Wapaka County, where he bought a small dairy farm and never worked timber again. He didn't take the ledger. He left it on the shelf in the office shack with the pencil entry still there on the page, dated and impossible. Years later, when someone asked him why he left logging, he said only that some places teach you when to walk away, and smart men listen. The camp itself shut down for good in 1926, when the best of the white pine was gone and the lumber company moved operations further west into Minnesota. The bunkhouse was stripped for salvage, the cookhouse torn down, the stable sold to a farmer who didn't ask where it came from. By 1930, the clearing where the camp had stood was grown over with birch and aspen, and unless you knew where to look, you'd never know men had lived and worked there. The road to Mile 7 stayed open longer. Logging trucks used it through the early 30s, hauling hardwood and hemlock down to the mills in Phillips and Park Falls, but the drivers wouldn't make the run alone, and they wouldn't make it after dark. And when the Civilian Conservation Corps started building new roads through Price County in the mid-30s, the old logging road was quietly bypassed and left to grow over. By 1940, Mile 7 was hard to find unless you knew the forest. The ruts had filled in. The pines had reclaimed the edges. The spot where Slate's tracks had ended was unmarked and anonymous, just another stretch of Wisconsin woods that looked like every other stretch, except that the people who lived nearby still wouldn't walk it after sunset. The stories didn't fade the way stories usually do. They hardened into rules, and the rules became part of the culture of Price County the way bedrock becomes part of a foundation. Parents told their children. Foremen told new workers. Hunting guides told clients from downstate, "Don't go up past Mile 5 alone. Don't go after dark. Don't answer if you hear bells in the pines. And if your dog won't cross a certain line in the snow, you listen to the dog." In 1947, a surveyor from the State Forestry Service was mapping old logging roads for a reforestation project. He camped alone near the site of the old sled yard and spent 3 days walking transects with a compass and a measuring chain. On his second night, he heard bells, soft and rhythmic, moving through the trees just beyond the edge of his firelight. He called out, thinking it was another camper or a hunter with pack animals. The bells stopped. He called again. Nothing answered. He wrote in his field notes that the sound had been distinct and clear, and that he had felt an overwhelming urge to follow it into the dark. He also wrote that he had packed his gear and left the area before dawn, and that he would not be returning to finish the transect. The field notes are still on file with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Nobody ever completed that survey. In 1955, a teacher at the elementary school in Phillips assigned her students to interview their grandparents about the logging era. One boy, 11 years old, interviewed his grandfather, a retired skidder named Einar, who had worked in Price County through the 20s. The boy asked if anything strange had ever happened in the camps. Einar was silent for a long time, and then he told the story of the gray husky that disappeared on the road to Mile 7. He told it carefully, without exaggeration, the way a man tells something he doesn't want to remember but can't forget. At the end, he said, "There are places up in these woods that don't follow the rules we know. Your teacher won't want to hear that, but it's true, and if you're smart, you'll remember it." The boy turned in a different report about log drives and river dams, but he remembered what his grandfather said, and years later, when he bought land in Price County to build a hunting cabin, he checked old maps to make sure he wasn't building anywhere near the old Mile 7 road. The rules held. Through the 40s and 50s and 60s, as the logging camps became history and the forests grew back and Price County turned toward tourism and dairy farming and small manufacturing, the old boundaries stayed in place. People didn't talk about them much, especially not to outsiders, but they honored them. Certain trails were walked in pairs. Certain stretches of forest were avoided after dusk. Certain sounds heard in the pines at night were not investigated. In 1968, a historical society in Phillips tried to put together an exhibit on the logging era. They collected photographs, tools, ledgers, and oral histories from the men who had worked the camps. One of the ledgers they acquired was Torvald X. camp log from the winter of 1924. The ledger was donated anonymously, left on the steps of the Historical Society building in a wooden crate with no note. When the curator opened it and found the entry dated, the night slate disappeared. Dog back 11:47 p.m., harness intact. She made a photocopy and then closed the book and put it in storage. She told the other volunteers that some things were better left in boxes, and that particular ledger was not included in the exhibit. The photocopy is still in the archives, filed under Unexplained Incidents, 1920s. The original ledger was destroyed in a fire in 1973. Some people say that's a coincidence. Others say fires have a way of taking care of things that shouldn't be kept. In 1982, a man hiking the Ice Age trail near the old timber country found a dog collar hanging from a birch branch about 6 feet off the ground. The leather was old but intact, still fastened in a loop. The man took it down and brought it to an antique shop in Park Falls, thinking it might be worth something. The shop owner looked at it, asked where it had been found, and handed it back without offering a price. He said quietly that some things don't belong in shops, and if the man was smart, he'd put it back where he found it. The hiker thought that was strange, but he didn't argue. He drove back to the trailhead that same afternoon and hung the collar back on the branch. When he checked the next morning, the collar was gone. He told the story to a friend who had grown up in Price County. The friend nodded and said, "You did the right thing." He didn't explain further, and the hiker didn't ask. In 2003, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources proposed reopening part of the old logging road as a snowmobile trail. The proposal included a section that would have run through the area known locally, though not on any official map, as Mile 7. A public meeting was held in Phillips. 70 people attended, an unusually high turnout for a trail proposal. Not one person spoke in favor of the plan. Several older residents spoke against it, citing concerns about safety, environmental impact, and the need to respect historical sites. One man in his 80s stood and said simply, "Some roads were closed for a reason. Leave them closed." The proposal was withdrawn. The Forest Service official who had presented the proposal asked afterward why people were so opposed. A local woman in her 50s said, "Because the people who live here know better." She didn't elaborate, and the official didn't press. Today, the old logging road is gone. The forest has taken it back completely. GPS maps show nothing. Topographic maps show nothing. But the people in Price County still know where Mile 7 used to be, and they still don't go there after dark. Hunting guides mark it as off-limits without explaining why. Parents still tell children that if they're ever hiking and their dog refuses to go forward, they should trust the dog and turn around. The stories are told quietly, around campfires and kitchen tables, not to scare but to teach. There are 3 ways to explain what happened to Slate in the winter of 1924. The first is human. Someone stole the dog. Someone with a grudge against Torvald or the camp. Someone who knew the routes and the timing, who took the Husky and covered the tracks and planted false signs to confuse the search. The ledger entry was a prank. The duplicate strap was a trick. The warm nail was coincidence or misremembering. Men under stress see what they expect to see, and a logging camp in deep winter is a place where fear spreads fast. The second is natural. The dog fell through ice that looked solid, or was killed by a wolf or a lynx so quickly there was no struggle, or ran off injured and died somewhere the searchers never reached. The strange signs were the result of cold, exhaustion, and the way the forest plays with sound and shadow when men are desperate to find answers. The woods are vast, and it's easy to miss a body, even when you're looking. The third explanation is the one nobody in Price County says out loud, but everybody knows. It's the one that accounts for the tracks that ended in smooth snow, the one that explains the boot nail warm and killing cold, the strap that appeared twice, the sled marks with no sled, the dogs that refused to cross a line they couldn't see, the one that makes sense of the ledger entry written in Torvald's hand on a page he swears he never touched, the one that explains why people still hear bells in the pines on violet evenings, and why no one ever follows the sound. It's the explanation that says the forest around Mile 7 is a place where the rules are different, where something listens and learns and remembers, where a dog can vanish mid-stride and leave behind pieces of itself, warm pieces, placed where they'll be found like a message or a warning or a promise that nothing is finished. Which version makes sense when you hold all the pieces together? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one that people in Wisconsin still won't name out loud even a century later? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.